left to die on a funeral pyre while still alive. A cowboy lifted her off and gave her a birthday forever. The smell hit me before I saw anything. That's the thing nobody tells you. Before the smoke, before the orange, before your brain catches up to what your eyes are delivering, it's the smell. Cedar, mostly. Then something underneath the cedar that I don't want to name. I'd been riding south along the rimrock since before first light, pushing the Grulla toward Caleb Marsh's trading post before the morning freight wagon came through. I had a commission in my saddlebag, signed by the territorial commissioner, ordering a survey of the grazing boundary between the Harlow Range and the Federal Reserve land to the east. 3 weeks of work, $40. I needed it. I wasn't looking for anything else. The fire was down in a draw off the north side of the Ochoko Trail, maybe a quarter-mile from the main road. Hidden enough that a man not paying attention would ride straight past. I might have. I'd been half asleep in the saddle, thinking about the survey lines, about whether the Grulla's left foreleg was holding up, about whether Caleb still kept a decent pot of coffee going in the mornings. But the Grulla stopped. He does that. When something is wrong, when a thing is not right in the air around us, that horse plants all 4 feet and will not be moved until I have acknowledged whatever he's acknowledged. I've learned not to argue with him. 11 years he's been under me, and he's been right every single time I pushed against that stubbornness of his. I sat up straight and looked. Down in the draw, maybe 200 yards off the trail, fire. A structure of stacked timber, green juniper stripped of branches, maybe 8 feet long, 3 feet high, enough wood to burn hot and long. The flames were young still, maybe 10 minutes old by the look of the base. Yellow at the crown, going blue at the center. I didn't think much. I put my heels in. The Grulla went down the slope in 4 long strides, and I was off him before he'd fully stopped, my boots hitting rocky ground and sliding a half step before I caught myself. The heat was already there, pushing back at me, and the smoke was thicker down in the draw than it looked from above, catching in the low air, not rising the way it should. She was in the middle of the pile. Not dead, that was the first thing I registered. Not dead because her hands were moving, slowly like a thing swimming in deep water, fingers dragging against the stacked wood, not with any real force but moving. Her eyes were closed. Her hair was spread loose across the wood, and the ends nearest the fire had already begun to curl and blacken. I pulled my coat off, beat the near edge of the fire back 2 steps, and went in from the upwind side where the heat was bearable for about 3 seconds at a time. She was bound at the wrists, not tightly, not the way you'd bind a prisoner, more the way you'd bind someone you wanted to keep still rather than restrained. Rawhide cord, dry as a bone, already smoking. I got my knife under the cord, cut, sheathed the knife, put both arms under her, one under her shoulders, one under her knees, and lifted. She wasn't light, but she wasn't much. 20-some years old, I figured later. Modoc dress, beaded at the collar, the beadwork half burned away on the left side. Her face was turned toward my chest, and she made a sound when I moved her, a low sound that wasn't a word in any language, just the sound a body makes when it's still in it. I carried her up out of the draw. The Grulla came to me. That's how he is. He came sideways, closing the distance, and I got her up across the saddle on her stomach, climbed up behind her, and held her there with one arm across the back of her legs while I turned him north. I didn't go to Caleb's. There was a line shack about 6 miles northeast, on the edge of the Federal Reserve land, that I'd used twice before as a base camp during survey work. A stove, a cot, a decent roof. I went there. I don't know how much time passed before she woke up. I'd gotten a fire going in the stove, not too hot. She'd had enough fire, just enough for warmth, because she was shivering hard by the time I got her off the horse. I'd done what I could for the burns. The worst were on her left arm, from elbow to wrist, and on the left side of her neck. Not deep enough to be life-threatening, I thought, but I'm not a doctor. I'd used the salve I kept in my kit, lanolin-based, the kind you use for rope burns on horses, and wrapped her arm in clean linen from the roll I carried for my own injuries. I'd been doing survey work in rough country long enough to know. You carry what you need because no one is coming to help you. She woke up around midday, judging by the light through the shack's one window. She didn't startle the way most people do when they wake somewhere strange. She came up slow, eyes opening, going still, taking it in. The ceiling, the stove, the light, me sitting in the one chair about 8 feet from the cot, not doing anything with my hands, just sitting. She looked at me for a long time. I said in the clearest, plainest English I had. You were on a burning pile of wood. I took you off it. You're in a line shack about 6 miles from where I found you. I haven't sent for anyone. I'm not going to send for anyone unless you want me to. I don't know how much of that she understood. She was watching my mouth. Her eyes were dark and dry, and she had a quality of stillness to her that made me think she'd been still before, in situations where stillness was survival. She said something in Modoc. I didn't know Modoc. I shook my head. She switched to something else, Chinook jargon, the trade tongue, and I knew enough of that to get the shape of what she was saying. She wanted to know if I was alone. I told her yes. She wanted to know if I worked for the military. I told her no. I showed her the surveyor's commission in my saddlebag, the territorial seal, the lack of any soldier's markings on my gear. She looked at it for a long time, and I could see her deciding something. She asked if she could have water. I gave it to her. She drank carefully, not greedily, the way a careful person drinks, a person who has learned that taking too much too fast can make things worse. I refilled the cup from the canteen and left it beside her on the floor within reach. Then I sat back down. I want to be clear about something because it matters to what comes after. I didn't help her because I'd decided who she was or what she deserved or what was owed to her. I helped her because she was a living woman on a burning pile of wood, and I was the man standing there. That was the whole of it. A man does what's in front of him to do, or he doesn't. I've never seen a use for the ones who don't. Her name in English approximation was something I couldn't say right for the first 3 days. She eventually told me to call her Calla, which was the name a missionary woman had given her some years before. She used it like a tool, like a key that opened certain doors, not as her name, but as a name that worked in this context with a man like me. I respected that. I used it. I stayed at the shack for 4 more days. This was not my plan. My plan had been $40 and a survey commission and moving on. But I looked at her arm on the second morning and I knew she couldn't travel. The burns were weeping, which meant they needed to stay clean, which meant she needed someone with supplies and a steady hand and a fire for boiling water. I had all of those things. I sent the Grulla down to Caleb's on the 3rd day. He knows the way, he's made that run before, with a note on his saddle strap asking Caleb to send back whatever salve and bandage cloth he had in the post supplies. Caleb, to his credit, didn't ask questions. He sent back a small box with the supplies, a wheel of hardtack cheese, and a note that said only, 3 days before Harlow's men come through this way. It was a warning, not a report. Caleb Marsh is that kind of man. By the 3rd day, Calla and I had established a rough language between us. Chinook, some English, some gestures, some silences that meant specific things. She told me in pieces what had happened. There was a faction within her people's camp, a hard faction, men who had decided that the agreements being made with the territorial agents were a kind of death, a slow surrender, and who responded to anything that looked like accommodation with punishment. Calla had spoken to a territorial agent. Not in support of anything, she told me. She'd answered his questions about where water could be found in the dry season, practical questions. A man lost and thirsty asking a woman who knew the land. In the hard faction's accounting, this was enough. The Pyre had not been a death sentence, technically. The way she explained it, it was a warning. They left people alive sometimes, shamed, burned, left to make their way or not. The message was to the living as much as to the person on the wood. I listened to this. I didn't say much. What I thought was, there are men everywhere who do to women what cannot be done back, who use the weight of rules and factions and codes to press down on whoever is smallest and quietest. This was not a problem of one people or one place. I'd seen it in Georgia. I'd seen it in Missouri. I'd seen it in cattle camps and mining towns and everywhere in between. The violence of men who mistake cruelty for authority. What I said was, you're not going back to that camp. She looked at me a long time when I said that. She said, where then? I said, I don't know yet. Let the arm heal first. She nodded. She seemed more than afraid or uncertain, simply practical. A woman who had been making decisions about her own survival for a long time and who recognized that the current situation had changed and who was assessing the new terrain. I respected that too. On the 5th day, I sent her north. There was a woman I knew named Agnes Flood, a rancher's widow who ran a boarding house in Willowbridge, 40 miles north. I'd done survey work on Agnes's property boundary twice, and she was straight as an iron rail, and she did not ask unnecessary questions. I wrote her a letter on the back of my surveyor's notebook paper, sealed it with saddle wax, and told Calla to ask for Agnes by name and give her the letter first, before saying anything else. I put her on my spare horse, a leggy bay I'd bought the previous spring and hadn't yet sold, gave her 3 days' worth of provisions in my extra saddlebag, and drew her a rough map in the dirt with a stick. She looked at the map, she looked at me. She asked what I wanted in return. I said nothing. She didn't believe me, not all the way, I could see that. She'd had enough history with men who offered things to know that nothing is rarely nothing, but she was practical and she was running out of options, and the arm needed proper care. She took the map. Before she rode out, she stopped the bay horse even with me and looked down. She said in English that was better than she'd let on, "Tell me your name." I told her. "Cole Dunmore," she said back, testing the shape of it. "That's right." She looked at me another moment. Not gratitude, exactly, not the way a woman in a story looks at a man who saved her. More like the way you look at something you want to understand and haven't finished yet. Then she rode north, and I watched her go until the horse's line was gone in the scrub juniper. I stood there for a while with my hands in my pockets. Then I went back to the shack, packed my kit, got on the grulla, and rode to start the survey. I've said this took 3 weeks, it took 5. The boundary dispute between Harlow and the Federal Reserve was worse than the commission papers had suggested. A 40-year-old survey mark had been moved, or had been wrong to begin with, and sorting out the original cornerstones involved 2 days of digging in rocky ground and another day of riding to the territorial clerk's office in Sage Falls to look at deeds. I didn't mind. Survey work suits me. You're looking at facts. You're looking at the land as it is, not as anyone wants it to be. What I kept coming back to out there was the smell, the cedar and what was under it. And her hands moving, slowly, like she was swimming up from somewhere deep. I finished the survey, I filed the report, I collected my $40. Then I rode north to Willowbridge. I told myself it was because I needed to sell the bay horse and Willowbridge was as good a place as any. I told myself I had a debt to settle with Agnes Flood for the trouble I'd sent her way. I was lying to myself and I knew it. I just wasn't ready to say so out loud. Agnes Flood opened the door of her boarding house before I finished tying the grulla to the post. She was 60-something, built like a fence post, with gray hair pinned in a tight coil and eyes that had seen enough to stop being surprised by most things. She said, "Dunmore." I said, "Agnes." She looked at me for a moment the way I imagined she looked at the weather, taking inventory. Then she said, "She's here. She's been working for me for 3 weeks. She can cook and she's not afraid of hard work, and she's learned enough English to run circles around most of the men in this county. Don't you go making trouble." I said I hadn't come to make trouble. Agnes looked like she reserved judgment. She let me in. Calla was in the kitchen. She was standing at the far counter with her back to the doorway, cutting dried apples into a bowl. Her left arm was wrapped in clean white cloth from wrist to elbow, the kind of bandaging that said a proper doctor had been at it. She moved without any favoring of it, which was a good sign. She heard me come in the way you hear something you've been half listening for. She turned around. I don't know what I'd expected. I suppose I'd expected to feel uncertain, the way you feel when you've done something and then have to stand in front of it and account for it. But I didn't feel that. I felt something else that I didn't have a word for then and still don't, entirely. Something about the fact that she was standing there in a warm kitchen with flour on her sleeve and her arm healing, and she was looking at me with her head tilted slightly to the right the way she did when she was deciding something. She said, "You came." I said I had to sell the bay horse. She looked at me steadily. "He wasn't worth much," I said, "but it was a reason to come north." A very small change in her expression, not quite a smile, something that lived in the vicinity of one. She went back to cutting apples. She said, "Sit down if you're going to stay." I sat down. Agnes in the doorway behind me made a sound that might have been approval or might have been skepticism, probably both. Then she left us to it. I stayed in Willowbridge for 2 weeks. I slept in Agnes's barn, which was clean and dry, and which Agnes charged me a fair $1 a night for. I took meals in the kitchen. I fixed 3 things on Agnes's property that needed fixing: a broken hinge on the barn door, a section of fence along the north pasture that was leaning toward failure, and a water diversion from the creek that had silted up and was causing Agnes's kitchen garden to dry out. I did these things because they were there to be done, and because I was good at them. Calla watched me work. Not constantly, not following me around. But she had a quality of peripheral attention. She knew where I was and what I was doing, and she was taking notes in some private ledger inside herself. I was aware of being assessed, and I didn't mind it. I've always thought that a person with the judgment to assess carefully is worth knowing. On the 5th day, she came and worked alongside me on the water diversion. She was quiet, and she was fast, and she'd watched me long enough to know what I needed before I asked for it. We worked for 4 hours and got the thing done, and then we sat on the bank of the creek, and I shared the corn cake I had in my jacket pocket, and she didn't talk for a while. Then she said, "You didn't have to come." "No, but you came." "Yes." She was quiet for another moment. The creek made a steady sound over the rocks, which were red-brown and smooth from a long time of water. The light was coming in low from the west, the kind of light that makes everything look like it's been sitting there since the beginning of time. She said, "Why?" I thought about it. I didn't want to say something that sounded like a story a man tells about himself. I'm not that kind of man, or I try not to be. I said, "I needed to know you were all right." She looked at me. "I've been doing this work a long time," I said, "moving from place to place, doing what's in front of me and moving on. I've gotten good at not needing to know how things came out. But I found I needed to know about this one." She looked away at the creek. She said, in a voice that was level and factual, not asking for anything, "Most men who do something for a woman want to own it afterward." "I know," I said. "You don't want that?" "No. What do you want, then?" I looked at the water for a while. "I don't know exactly," I said. "To be useful to something that matters, to not be somewhere temporary. I've been somewhere temporary for a long time." I hadn't meant to say that last part. It came out because it was true, and I was tired of carrying it unspoken. She turned and looked at me with that stillness of hers. She said that I understand. I told her what I knew about myself in the days after that. Not all at once. It came out in pieces, the way real things come out, over meals and work and one long evening when a thunderstorm kept us both inside the kitchen and Agnes had gone to bed, and there was nothing to do but talk. I told her I was 43 years old, which was not old but not young, and that I had spent most of those years moving. Born in Virginia, went west at 19 with nothing, worked cattle drives through Texas, worked as a scout for the Army for 6 years along the Snake River country, left the Army when I'd seen enough of what it did to the people it called enemies. Did survey work because a man named Porthel had taught me to use a transit and a chain, and told me I had a natural head for angles and distance. I told her I had been married once. Her name was Martha. She'd been a schoolteacher in a small town in eastern Oregon, and we'd been married for 3 years, and she died of a fever in the 4th winter. There was nothing dramatic about it. She was there and then she was not there, and the house we'd been renting felt like a different house after, and I stayed in it for 2 months, and then I sold what little furniture there was and started moving again. That had been 9 years before. Calla listened to all of this. She asked 1 or 2 questions about Martha, whether it had been sudden, and I said yes, it had been fast. About the Army, what exactly I'd seen. I told her in plain terms without anger because the anger had burned down to something like a cold fact a long time ago. When I was done, she was quiet for a while. The rain was steady on the roof. Then she told me her own things. I won't say all of it here. It's not mine to say. What I will tell you is that she had been making her way through a world that pushed against her from every direction for the better part of her life. She was 24 years old, which was 9 years younger than me, and she had seen things that some people never see. She was not soft, and she did not want sympathy. What she wanted, I understood, was to be known accurately, not to have someone decide what she was before they'd finished looking. I told her I had never made a decision about her except that she was alive, and she should stay that way. She looked at me with her head tilted again. She said that was enough. Agnes Flood, for her part, observed all of this with the detachment of a woman who has watched human beings make decisions for 60-some years, and has stopped being astonished by any of them. On the morning of my 2nd week in Willowbridge, she appeared in the barn where I was brushing the grella and she stood in the doorway for a moment, and then she said, "I'm going to tell you something." I said, "All right." She said, "I've had a dozen men come through this town in the past year asking me to take in a woman who needed somewhere to be. Half of them came back to check on her within the month. Of those, half had intentions I can only describe as unfortunate. The other half were like you." I waited. "The other half," she said, "were actually decent. Just didn't know what to do about it yet." I said, "Agnes." She said, "I'm not telling you what to do. I'm telling you what I see because I've earned the right to say what I see. That woman in my kitchen has been hurt in ways she will carry for a long time, and she doesn't need a rescuer. She's had enough of people deciding they know what she needs. What she needs is someone who shows up and stays and does what's in front of him to do. Which," she added dryly, "appears to be your only talent." Then she left. I stood there with the brush in my hand. I thought, she's not wrong about the only talent. There is a moment I want to tell you about. I've turned it over in my mind more times than I can count, trying to get at what exactly it was. It was the evening of my 11th day in Willowbridge. I'd been out working on a fence line I'd offered to repair for the man who owned the property adjacent to Agnes's, a Norwegian named F. Gelda who was getting too old to do the heavy post work himself. I came in late after dark. Agnes had already gone to bed. The kitchen was empty except for the lamp on the table and a plate left out for me, covered with a cloth, beans, cornbread, a piece of salt pork. I sat down and ate. The lamp was burning low. The house was quiet the way a house gets quiet when everyone in it is settled for the night, and the sounds are just the sounds of a building holding still. A creak from the second step on the staircase, the pop of a cooling stovepipe, wind in the eaves. Then the staircase creaked again, and Calla came down. She was in her night clothes, a flannel shirt and trousers she'd borrowed from Agnes, more practical than a gown, and her hair was loose, and she stopped at the bottom of the stairs and looked at me sitting at the table, and for a moment neither of us said anything. She came and sat across from me. She said, "You haven't said anything about leaving." I said, "No. You've been here 11 days. I know. Agnes has been charging you for the barn." "Fair enough." She was quiet. She had her hands folded on the table, her left arm still wrapped but thinner now, less bandage healing. Then she said, "I want to tell you something, and I need you to let me finish before you say anything." I put my fork down. She said, "I have been thinking about this since you showed up at Agnes's door, about what you did and what it means and what you are. I've been trying to find what's wrong with it. I'm good at finding what's wrong with things. I've had to be." She paused. "I can't find it," she said. I waited. "You are what you appear to be," she said. "A man who did what was in front of him and then did it again and then kept doing it. A man who has nothing to prove and no one to perform for. I haven't," she stopped, tried again. "I haven't been known accurately before, by anyone who wasn't already dead. It's a strange thing. I don't know what to do with it." She looked at me directly. "I'm not asking you to rescue me," she said. "I'm not a woman who needs rescuing anymore. I got myself off that pyre eventually, or I would have. But I'm asking you," and here her voice changed just slightly, went a fraction more careful, "whether you intend to leave. Because I can make a life here with Agnes. That's a thing I can do, but if you're going to stay in my vicinity, I need to know if it's on purpose." I sat back in my chair. This was a woman asking a straight question and requiring a straight answer. Not wanting sentiment, not wanting a speech, wanting to know the actual facts of the matter. I said, "I intend to stay in your vicinity." She looked at me. "On purpose," I said. Something changed in her face. Not a collapse, not a flood of emotion, just a settling, like something that had been held carefully for a long time was allowed to rest. She reached across the table and put her right hand, her good hand, palm down over mine where it was flat on the table. That was all. She didn't say anything. She just held it there, her hand on mine, steady and warm, and I felt the pressure of it in my chest somewhere. Not painfully, just solidly, the way you feel something true. After a while she said, quietly, "I didn't think it would be a surveyor." I said, "I didn't think it would be anybody." She made a sound that was, finally, a real laugh, a short one, but real. Then she took her hand back and stood up. She said, "We'll talk more in the morning." I said, "All right." She went back up the stairs. I sat there for a while with my hands on the table and the lamp burning low, and the house quiet around me. That was how it started. There's no neater way to say it. We talked in the morning, as she'd said. We talked for most of a week in the hours around the work, the kitchen, the creek bank, the long evenings after Agnes had gone to bed. Not romantic talking, not the kind of talking that happens in parlors with a chaperone pretending not to listen. The practical talking of two people who are deciding something real, what we each needed, what we each couldn't do without, where we draw lines. She was not a woman who wanted someone to run her life. I was not a man who wanted to run anyone's. What we were, both of us, was tired of being somewhere temporary. Tired of making our own way in the particular loneliness that comes from competence, from being so good at managing alone that no one thinks to ask whether you want to. She asked me once if I was afraid. I said, of what specifically? She said, of it going wrong, of losing again. I thought about Martha, about the 2 months in that house. I said, yes, but I'm more tired of being afraid of it than I am afraid of it. She nodded slowly. She said, that's the right answer. Agnes had a contact in a settlement called Dura Creek, about 30 miles west, a man named Vasquez who ran a small cattle operation and was looking for someone who knew land surveys and federal boundary work. I wrote Vasquez a letter. He wrote back. It was good work. Not $40, $120 for the season, with a small cabin on the property for a man and his wife, if he had one. And there was a root cellar and a working well and a kitchen garden that had gone unattended but was recoverable. I showed Calla the letter. She read it twice. She said, a cabin. I said, yes. She said, on purpose. I said, yes. She folded the letter and handed it back to me and looked at me with that tilted head assessment, and then she said, when do we leave? I want to tell you about Dura Creek, about what it was like to come into a place with the intention of staying. We arrived in October, when the aspen along the creek were going gold, and the air had that particular cold in it that you only get at elevation, the kind that doesn't bite but settles, sits on you like a hand on a shoulder saying, this is real, this is now, pay attention. Vasquez was a small, serious man who shook my hand and then shook Calla's with the same gravity, which told me what I needed to know about him. He showed us the cabin without commentary, let us look at it ourselves, and left us to it. It was small, one main room, one smaller room off the back that must have been a bedroom. A stove that had seen better days but still drew. 2 windows, both intact. A board floor, not dirt. I noted that as a sign that someone had cared once. The kitchen garden was a tangle of dead stems and volunteer squash, and it would want a full day's work just to assess. Calla walked through it slowly, touching things, the windowsill, the stovepipe, the edge of the table that had been left behind by whoever was there before. Not like she was inspecting them, like she was taking possession. She stood in the middle of the main room and looked at the light coming in through the western window, which was the better of the two, the glass cleaner. She said, I can make this work. I said, so can I. She looked at me. I said, together, I mean. She turned back to the window. She said quietly, I know what you mean, Cole. It was the first time she'd said my name like that, without the formal edge of a stranger using it. Just my name, flat and warm, like it was something that belonged to her too. The first winter was hard the way first winters in new places are hard. Everything taking longer than it should because you don't know the land yet, don't know its moods, don't know where the ice forms first, or where the wind comes from in a bad storm, or how to adjust the stovepipe damper for the particular draft this particular chimney makes. We figured it out, that's what I can tell you. We figured it out in the way that 2 capable people figure things out when they're working together with honesty and without ego, which is to say, not without arguments, but without the kind of arguments that leave marks. She knew things I didn't know. I knew things she didn't. We traded. Vasquez's wife, Elena, was a practical woman who took to Calla without sentiment, which is to say, she saw immediately that here was a woman worth knowing, and she knew her. The 2 of them had a language built inside of 3 weeks that I didn't have full access to, a language of kitchen work and plant knowledge, and the particular intelligence of women who have managed difficult circumstances and come out the other side with their wits about them. I didn't mind being outside that language. It was good that she had it. What Vasquez made of me, I learned slowly. He was a man who watched before he spoke, and what he said after watching was usually worth the wait. 3 months into the winter, sitting at his kitchen table after supper, he said, "You know what, Dura Creek doesn't have that it needs." I said I didn't. He said, "A man who knows the land, not just this range, the whole county. The water sources, the grazing boundaries, who owns what and where the disputed lines are. The territorial commissioner sends a survey team once every 4 years, and they get it wrong every time because they don't know the land, they just have a transit and a chain. What I need," he said, "is someone who stays." I looked at him. He said, "I'll put up the capital for an office in Dura Creek if you'll put up the work. We split the fees. You get the cabin permanent and I get a man I can trust to know what's what." I thought about it for about 4 seconds. I said, "Done." He nodded. He poured us both another cup of coffee. Then he said, without looking up, "She's good for you. You come in from the field looking like a man who has somewhere to be." I said, "Yes." He said, "That's worth more than most men know." The office in Dura Creek was a narrow room between the post office and the saddlers, 12 by 14 feet, with a south-facing window that was good for the drafting work. I put up a sign that was plain and factual. See DUNNMORE, Land Survey and Boundary Consultation. The first 6 months were slow. That was fine. Word travels in cattle country at the speed of trust, not the speed of advertising. In the 7th month, a rancher named Holt came in from the eastern range with a boundary dispute that had been running for 11 years between him and a neighbor named Cairns. He had a sheaf of deeds going back to the original territorial grant, all of them contradicting each other in the way documents do when no one has bothered to do the actual measurement work. I spent 2 weeks on it. I rode the boundary with both Holt and Cairns present, which was uncomfortable, because they hated each other with the focused energy of men who have been feuding long enough to have forgotten what they were originally fighting about. And I put the correct cornerstones in the correct places, and I produced a document with drawings and measurements and citations to the original survey records that neither of them could argue with. Cairns argued with it anyway. Cairns was that kind of man. But the territorial court upheld it, and after that, people in the county knew what C. Dunmore meant. A man you could trust to find the line and put it where it actually was. I won't pretend it was always smooth. There were men who didn't like that I'd come from somewhere else, that I didn't have 20 years of local history behind me. There were men who didn't like that Calla was my wife, who made their opinions known in the way men do when they're cowards about it, indirectly, obliquely, through small rudeness and studied ignorance. I handled it the way I handle most things. I worked. I did the job well and I charged fairly and I didn't perform for anyone's approval. You can't make every man respect you, but you can make it hard for a reasonable man to find fault, and over enough time the unreasonable ones start to look unreasonable even to themselves. Calla had her own way of handling it. She was not aggressive and she was not meek, and she had a quality, when someone was rude to her, of going very still and looking at them with a level, unhurried attention that seemed to make most people deeply uncomfortable with themselves. I'd seen full-grown men shift their weight and find reasons to look at their boots. Agnes Flood said when I told her about it, "That's the talent, not the sweetness, the willingness to make a man sit with what he is." There's a thing I want to tell you about birthdays. It's how this started in a way, and it's how I want to end it because it's the truest piece of the whole of it. Calla didn't know her birthday. She knew the season she was born, late summer, she thought, from what she'd been told as a child, but not the day. Not the year exactly. She'd never celebrated it. It hadn't seemed to her like a notable absence. There are more important things to not have than a birthday. But she'd mentioned it once offhand in the second winter, and I'd filed it away. The following August I asked Elena Vasquez, who had become, by then, someone who knew Calla the way you know a person after years of kitchen mornings and shared work, whether she had any idea what day might feel right. Elena thought about it. She said, "The 14th. She told me once the elderberries were ripe when she was born. The 14th is when they come ripe in the high country." I had no way of knowing if that was right, but right wasn't exactly the point. On the 14th of August, I got up before dawn and made the cornbread she liked, with the green chili from the kitchen garden, the way Elena had shown me. And I put it on the table with a small parcel wrapped in paper that I'd had a woman in Dura Creek tie up properly, because my knot tying is practical and not decorative. Inside the parcel was a pair of work gloves, leather good quality, the kind made to last 10 years of hard use. not sentimental. She'd mentioned twice that her gloves were worn through. And underneath the gloves, a note in my handwriting, which is not elegant. It's the hand of a man who writes measurements all day, but it was legible, that said, August 14. Every year from here. She came downstairs and stopped at the table. She stood there for a moment without picking anything up, just looking. Then she picked up the note. She read it. She held it for a long time, longer than it took to read 4 words. She was standing with her back to me, at the window, in the August morning light coming in through the clean glass we'd replaced in the spring. When she turned around, her face was doing several things at once, and she didn't try to stop any of them. She said, August 14. I said, every year. She crossed the room and she put both her hands on my chest and she looked up at me and I looked down at her. And for a moment we just stayed like that, her hands flat against me and her eyes dark and steady and certain. And I could feel the warmth of her palms through my shirt and the weight of her standing close and the particular stillness that is not emptiness but the opposite, fullness, arrival, the feeling of being in a place that is finally the right place. She said very quietly, You are a good man, Cole Dunmore. I didn't say anything right away. Nobody had said that to me in a long time. Not in those words, not with that weight behind them. I'd been competent, I'd been reliable, I'd been useful, I'd been the man who does what's in front of him. But there was a difference between being useful and being seen, between being needed and being known. She knew me. She'd been knowing me for 2 years by then, morning by morning and season by season, and this was her accounting of what she'd found. She said it like a fact, like a line in a survey, measured, verified, true. I put my hand over hers where it rested on my chest. I said, I've tried to be. She said, you are. And that was the whole of it. We stood there in the August light in the kitchen of the cabin in Dura Creek with the cornbread going warm on the table and her birthday established permanent on the calendar. And I held her hands against my chest and she held still in her way. And outside the window the summer morning was going about its business. The way mornings do, the way summers do, the world not pausing for anything. But inside that room there was something settled, something landed, something that had traveled a long way to be still. I think about that birthday sometimes, out on survey work, standing at a corner post in the middle of a field with a transit on my shoulder and the calculations running in my head. I think about a woman putting her hands on my chest and saying something true. The land stays where you put the stakes. That's what I've learned in a long life of measuring. The lines are real. You can argue about them and you can try to move them and you can ignore them for years, but the underlying truth of where a thing is doesn't change. She put her hands on my chest and said, You are a good man. That's where the stake went in. That's where the line is. I haven't needed to survey it again.